All right, so we're going to start chapter 19, which is a continuation of the cardiovascular system, but we're going to be looking specifically at the heart at this point. So we're going to scroll down here and get past the objectives and start 19.1. So 19.1, as it says here, is the heart anatomy. So we're going to really be just taking a look at the structures of the heart, where they're located, maybe why they're located a little bit, some of the physiology of it. But really in 19.1, we're just kind of pointing out all of the parts of the heart. And then in the following sections, we'll be talking about how those parts of the heart then come in to this whole system of pumping and getting it to the blood vessels. So the first part here, so the vital importance of the heart is obvious. So I think we all understand what the point of the heart is. It's to pump blood throughout the system, right? To get all of the nutrients, to get all of the wastes where they're going, to get the nutrients where they're going, to get oxygen where it's going, and carbon dioxide back to the heart or back to the lungs where it's going. So it's to move all of this stuff throughout the body, and the heart itself is the pump of that system. So if one assumes an average rate of contraction of 75 contractions per minute, a human heart would contract approximately 108,000 times in one day, so more than 39 million times in 1 year, and nearly 3 billion times during a 75-year lifespan. So you don't have to memorize those numbers at all. I just think it's interesting to point out how important it is and how incredible it is, because it is constantly going. It's not something where we take a break, like our arms, for example, at night. We kind of rest our muscles while we rest, but the heart doesn't get that rest. Each of the major pumping chambers of the heart ejects approximately 70 milliliters of blood per contraction in a resting adult. So that is a number you should be familiar with. So we're moving, each chamber is moving around about 70 milliliters of blood each time it contracts. And that's just during a rest period. So 5.25 liters of fluid per minute, you don't have to know that number, 14,000 liters per day. So again, just kind of looking at the enormity of what the heart is doing on an every minute, every day basis. All right, so let's take a look at our anatomy of the heart here. We're looking at, the location of the heart first. I'm going to zoom in a bit here. All right, so the human heart is located within the thoracic cavity. So if you recall from the first semester, the thoracic cavity is like the chest area below the rib cage or inside of the rib cage. Medially between the lungs, so medially meaning in the middle of or between the lungs, and the space known as the mediastinum. Okay, so you should recall the mediastinum, that center of the chest area. So in the figure, we'll take a look at that in a moment, where the position of the heart is within the thoracic cavity. Within the mediastinum, the heart is separated from other mediastinal structures by a tough membrane known as the pericardium. So the pericardium is this thick tissue membrane that's going to be protecting that heart in that area. Also can be called the pericardial sac, and it sits in its own space called the pericardial cavity. So cardial, and we'll see that as cardia, cardiac, having to do with the heart. So pericardium is around the heart, so peri meaning around, and then cardium referring to the heart, or pericardial sac, so peri again around, and cardial meaning heart, and then sac. And then also pericardial cavity, so peri again meaning around the heart, cavity, so the space that's around the heart. The dorsal surface of the heart lies near the bodies of the vertebrae. So remember, dorsal is like the back part. I always think of it as the dorsal fin on a type of fish. And so the dorsal surface is the back part of the heart. Lies near the bodies of the vertebrae. So remember, from skeletal system, the bodies are kind of the big roundish part of the vertebrae. So if you can imagine in the chest, we have the roundish bodies of the vertebrae, kind of toward the center of the body, and then the dorsal surface of the heart, so kind of the back part of the heart, lies near those bodies of the vertebrae. Its anterior surface, remember that's kind of the front surface, sits deep to the sternum and costal cartilages. Sternum meaning that kind of joint of those three bones in the front, the sternum in the very center of the chest, and then the costal cartilages, so the cartilage that is connecting that sternum to the ribs up in the top area. The great veins, which are the superior and inferior vena cava, and the great arteries, which are the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, are then attached to that superior surface of the heart. Remember, superior meaning kind of top-ish, superior surface of the heart, which is called the base. So when we take a look at a picture, you can actually probably scroll down here to the picture here. So if we look at this sagittal view here, you can see here are those parts of the vertebrae that I was talking about, the bodies of the vertebrae. And then you can see here, up here, is our mediastinum, or sternum, up here. And you can see this right here is the heart sitting in between those two things. And then, of course, coming from here, we have our costal cartilages, which is part of the rib cage there. So we have this, and then you can see this area right here, they have it kind of outlined, is the base of the heart. And then we'll look at the apex of the heart. So if we look at it down here, maybe this is a little familiar, it's kind of looking straight on, a forward view here. So you can see the ribs that would be coming around here. And then you can see the heart in the center. Okay, and up here are the great veins at the top here. We have our superior vena cava back here coming down. You can't see it because it's posterior. Would be the inferior vena cava. Then we have the aorta and our pulmonary trunk. And so where all of these things are attached, kind of in this area, is the base and the posterior side here. That's why this view up here was a little bit better, since it's the side view, a sagittal view. You can kind of see this is the posterior part, which would then go down to kind of the pointy part down here, which is called the apex of the heart, the pointy part. So if I think some things I've seen, maybe it's in this text, talks about it as kind of like an ice cream cone. The pointy bottom part of the ice cream cone is the apex, and then the ice cream part of the ice cream cone, the top part, would be the base. Okay. So the base of the heart is located at the level of the third costal cartilage, so counting down 1, 2, 3 costal cartilage as seen in the figure below. The inferior tip of the heart, so inferior meaning lower, and then that pointy part I was talking about, the tip, is called the apex, and it lies just to the left of the sternum, between the junction, so the joining of the 4th and 5th ribs, near its articulation with the costal cartilages, near where the ribs attach to the cartilage that connects it to the sternum. So when we're talking about that point, the apex, and the base, all of these words here, it's important that you understand where it's located. So understanding that the base is kind of to the back, posterior top part of the heart where all of the great veins are attached, and that the apex is kind of the pointy part that's a little bit more inferior or down on the body, and that lies to the left of the sternum. So that's something that is important to understand, is that the heart is not perfectly symmetrical, centered right underneath the sternum. It is underneath the sternum. However, that bottom part, the apex, actually points toward the left, and we'll see that difference as we're working through the cardiac system, or through the cardiovascular system. But also that's important when we get to the lungs and when we're looking at the respiratory system, because our lungs are designed differently. The left and the right lungs are designed differently because we need that space for the heart that's in the left side. So our left lung is different from the right because we have a little notch there from where the heart is. All right, so the right side of the heart is deflected anteriorly, and the left side is deflected posteriorly. All right, so we kind of see this shifting inside there. So the right side of the heart is a little bit more anterior, the left side is a little bit more posterior, so it's kind of at an angle. It's important to remember the position and the orientation of the heart when placing a stethoscope on the chest of a patient and listening for heart sounds. Also when looking at images taken from a mid-sagittal perspective. So that slight deviation of the apex to the left is reflected in a depression in the medial surface of the inferior lobe of the left lung. That's what I was saying. The lungs are different because of the heart being toward the left, and that's called the cardiac notch. So we'll see that again when we're talking about the respiratory system and working through that, that this kind of section, this little depression, is called the cardiac notch. And that's because we need space for the heart in the lung there. And you can see that in this view as well. So this is our right lung and the left lung. And you can see how the sternum, right, would be kind of in the center here. And you can see how it is a little bit more to the left here than it is to the right. It kind of is shifted. And you can even see that this right here is an auricle. We'll talk about that in a moment. But you can see this left auricle is shifted a little bit more around this way than the right auricle. So it's all kind of, it's not quite center, I guess is my point here, and that we have this cardiac notch right here in the left lung. All right. So let's keep talking about the heart here. So the shape and the size of the heart. The shape of the heart is similar to a pine cone, so they reference a pine cone here. Rather broad at the superior surface and then tapering down to the apex. The heart is approximately the size of your fist, so about 5 inches in length, about 3.5 inches wide, and about 2.5 inches thick. Given the difference between most members of the sexes, generally, the weight of a female heart is approximately 9 to 11 ounces. The weight of a male heart is approximately 11 to 12 ounces. Of course, that changes drastically when we look at different things like age, exercise levels, and all of that, height. So the heart of a well-trained athlete, for example, especially one that does aerobic sports, can be much, much larger than this. So it really depends, but these are general ideas. The cardiac muscle responds to exercise in a manner similar to that of the skeletal muscle. So what we see is we see an increase in the size of the individual cells, but we don't see an increase in the number of cells. And this is called hypertrophy. So then the hearts of athletes can then pump blood more effectively at lower rates than those of non-athletes. So their heart does a better job because the muscles are bigger and it's just more efficient. Enlarged hearts are not always the result of exercise, though. They can result from pathology, so there are certain types of diseases and things that can cause that, such as hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Hyper, right, meaning more than, and then trophic, and then cardio, or relating to the heart, myo, muscle, apathy. So we see this enlargement of the heart muscles. The cause of this is unknown. A lot of times they don't really know what's going on, but it often goes undiagnosed and can cause sudden death in otherwise healthy young people. So, but we do see that in athletes, but their heart is more efficient. It's been developed that way to be more efficient. All right, so let's take a look at the heart here. The heart consists of 4 chambers. The left side and the right side each have 1 atrium and 1 ventricle. So each of the upper chambers, so the right atrium, again here plural is atria, so if we're talking about the atria, that would be both the left and the right atrium. So then we have the right atrium and the left atrium, and those are our receiving chambers. So they receive the blood, and then it will be moved down into our ventricles. So the atria receive the blood, and then our ventricle, it'll drain down into our ventricles that then pump the blood. So they act as the receiving chamber, and then they contract to push the blood into the lower chambers, which are the right ventricle and the left ventricle. And then these ventricles serve as the primary pumping chambers of the heart. So they propel the blood. They really force the blood, push it to either the lungs or the rest of the body, depending on the side we're talking about. And we'll get into that detail. We generally talk about them as 2 different circuits. They're linked, however, 2 distinct but linked circuits in the human circulation: the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. So both of these things, both of these circuits carry all of the stuff. So they have carbon dioxide, they have oxygen, they have nutrients, they have waste. So they all carry all of this stuff. However, we kind of distinguish them from the point of view of gases. So when we're talking about the pulmonary circuit, we're talking about where the oxygen versus the carbon dioxide are. When we talk about systemic, we're talking about the same thing, oxygen versus carbon dioxide. So the pulmonary circuit, pulmonary, pulm, is relating to the lungs. So pulmonary circuit is going to the lungs. That's transporting blood to and from the lungs, where it picks up oxygen, so it's going to transport blood to the lungs. It's going to pick up oxygen, drop off the carbon dioxide, and so that the carbon dioxide can be exhaled. Then we have the systemic circuit. So as it sounds, systemic is going to the rest of the system, so the body tissues. So pulmonary is talking about the lungs part, and systemic circuit is talking about the rest of the system, the rest of the body. That's going to transport the oxygenated blood, so that has a lot of oxygen, O2, to virtually all of the tissues of the body, and then it's going to return relatively deoxygenated blood and carbon dioxide to the heart to be sent back to the pulmonary circulation. All right, so we have the pulmonary circuit, which is going to be picking up oxygen, dropping off carbon dioxide, and then we have our systemic circuit, which is carrying oxygen to all of the body tissues and then bringing carbon dioxide back up to the heart to then be sent to the pulmonary circuit. And we can take a look at that. There's an illustration down here of that. So they kind of show it in terms of the red and the blue here. The blue is considered deoxygenated blood, so blood that has less oxygen, deoxygenated without oxygen, but less oxygen. And the red is oxygenated blood, so blood that has lots of oxygen in it. So we can kind of see here our systemic system, or systemic circuit. We have our systemic capillaries, so these are the rest of the bodies picking up our carbon dioxide that's being released from our tissues from them doing their jobs, being metabolically active. They are going to drop off our carbon dioxide, and then we are taking the oxygen from the blood at this point. So it's deoxygenated blood. That deoxygenated blood is going to go up to the heart, part of the systemic circuit. So we have our capillaries, which are our smallest vessels. Then those capillaries are all going to join together and get into some veins from the lower body, bringing it up to the heart. It's actually going to go into our right atrium first, and then go into our right ventricle. And then up here, also part of the systemic circuit, up here we have our capillaries from the upper body. Again, the same thing. We're dropping off our oxygen. We are putting our CO2 into the blood, so it's deoxygenated blood here, gathering up into veins that are going to go into the right side of the heart. Go into the right atrium, and then drop down into our right ventricle. Then that deoxygenated blood, you can see it's still blue, is going to be going up through our pulmonary trunk, and then it's going to be pushed into the lungs, the left lung and the right lung. So you can see here, still blue, still deoxygenated. Once it's in the lungs, now we're part of this pulmonary circuit, because we're in the lungs now, pulmonary. So the pulmonary circuit is then, now we're bringing our deoxygenated blood into the lungs. We have our pulmonary capillaries, so the blood's getting into these small vessels, and as it's in the small vessels, we're going to be doing this exchange. So now we're dropping off our carbon dioxide, we're picking up our oxygen in both lungs. So over here, dropping off our carbon dioxide and picking up our oxygen. And as it's doing that, you can see if we're going in this direction, we're getting more and more red as an indicator of oxygenation. So more and more oxygen being picked up. Then we can see them go into, or see the blood vessels are then going to go into our left atrium, and then it's going to go from the left atrium into the left ventricle. And then we're getting a little messy here, but it's going to get pumped out via the aorta. And then it's going to go all the way down into the body tissues again, into our systemic circuit. So you can kind of think of this area in the middle here as being our pulmonary circuit, and then up and down here is our systemic circuit. Our arteries feeding our body with tissues that now has lots of oxygen. We're going to be dropping off that oxygen to the tissues, picking up the carbon dioxide, and then continuing on through both of those circuits. We can see a close-up view of that. We're going to go through this many, many times over, but we're going to be bringing stuff in from the systemic circuit, our deoxygenated blood via the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, going into here, our right atrium. They're joining up here. Then it's going to get pumped into our right ventricle, then pumped out via here, our pulmonary trunk. It's going to branch off into our left and our right lungs, our left pulmonary arteries, which we'll talk about in a moment. It's going to pick up oxygen, come back into the heart. So this is our pulmonary circuit out here, our lungs, so we're doing that exchange here. Then it's going to go back into our pulmonary veins. We have our right pulmonary veins and left pulmonary veins going into our left atrium, going to be pumped down into the left ventricle, and then pumped out underneath here, up through our aorta. All right, so those are the pulmonary and the systemic circuits, and we're going to see this a lot more. But so that's the distinguishing character, or those are the distinguishing characteristics between pulmonary, meaning the lungs, and then systemic, meaning the rest of the body. So the right ventricle pumps deoxygenated blood into the pulmonary trunk. We just saw that, which leads toward the lungs and bifurcates, so splits into two, into the left and the right pulmonary arteries, which we just saw. So these vessels in turn branch many times before reaching the pulmonary capillaries, because remember, capillaries are our smallest vessels, so we're going to have many vessels of different sizes until we get to the capillaries. So here is this part going up through here, the pulmonary trunk, and then this is where it bifurcates. So it's going to separate into our left pulmonary arteries, and then over here, going into the right lung, our right pulmonary arteries. All right, and then in those pulmonary capillaries, that's where we have our gas exchange. Our carbon dioxide exits the blood and oxygen enters. So the pulmonary trunk arteries, then our branches are the only arteries in the postnatal body that carry relatively deoxygenated blood. So at that point is where we have our very much deoxygenated blood, not nearly as much oxygen at that point. Our highly oxygenated blood that's returning from the pulmonary capillaries in the lungs passes through a series of vessels. Again, they get bigger and bigger and bigger, that join together to form then our larger ones that head into the heart, called the pulmonary veins. So the only postnatal veins in the body that carry highly oxygenated blood. So at that point it's very, very oxygenated because it just picked up all the oxygen it could to get it into the blood, and now we're heading through the pulmonary veins into the heart. So we saw that as well. We'll scroll down here just for another minute. So we're in the lungs, we're picking up our oxygen, and then we're going to head back out via our left pulmonary veins and right pulmonary veins. So now these vessels are carrying very, very oxygenated blood. All right, so the pulmonary veins conduct blood into the left atrium, which then pumps the blood into the left ventricle, which then pumps oxygenated blood into the aorta and onto the many branches of the systemic circuit. So we already looked at that. Eventually these vessels will lead to the systemic capillaries, where then we have that exchange, the carbon dioxide going in, the oxygen coming out of the blood. Also, this is, remember, nutrients are doing this also. Remember, we talk about it in terms of oxygen versus carbon dioxide. But just remember, all of these things are happening as well. We've got wastes that are moving into the blood. We've got nutrients moving out of the blood. All of these things are happening as well. All right. So then the blood that is exiting the systemic capillaries, or the blood exiting the systemic capillaries, is lower in oxygen concentration than when it entered. So the capillaries will ultimately unite to form venules, then veins, and then flowing into the major veins, which are the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava, that then return blood to the right atrium. And so we talked about that as well. So we get into our systemic capillaries, which remember are down here, are really small ones, and then they get bigger and bigger and bigger. Venules are medium-sized, and then we get into our veins, our great veins. And when we talk about those, we're talking about these larger ones here, the inferior vena cava that's going to feed right into our right atrium, and the superior vena cava, which is going to feed into the right atrium as well. All right, then that will pump blood into our right ventricle, and then this continues going over and over and over again as long as a person is alive. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the heart specifically, and then we'll look more at the circulation as well in the next couple sections. All right, so now we're going to take a look at the membrane that surrounds the heart, and then the prominent features of the heart, and then the layers of the heart. So let's first take a look at the membrane. So the membrane that directly surrounds the heart and defines the pericardial cavity is called the pericardium, or the pericardial sac. So we already mentioned that peri meaning around, and then cardium for heart, so around the heart. It also surrounds the roots of the major vessels, so where they're attached to the heart. The pericardium, which literally translates to around the heart, so peri meaning around, and then cardium, heart, consists of two distinct sublayers. So when we're talking about the pericardium, we have the outer fibrous pericardium and the inner serous pericardium. All right, so fibrous, as you can imagine, is fibrous, meaning thick and fibrous-y. And then the serous one is inner, which is more fluid and softer. The fibrous pericardium is made of tough, dense connective tissue that protects the heart and maintains its position in the thorax. So this is a really thick layer that's ultimately doing the most protection of the heart. And then there's the more delicate serous pericardium, which consists of two layers. The parietal pericardium, which is fused to the fibrous pericardium, and an inner visceral pericardium, which is also called the epicardium, which is fused to the heart and is part of the heart wall. And then we have the pericardial cavity, which is filled with a lubricating serous fluid that is between the epicardium, which remember is the inner part of the serous pericardium, and the pericardium. So let's take a look at the picture of that really quick so we get that down. All right, so this is a little chunk out of the side of the heart wall. Here's the myocardium. So when we think of the heart generally, here's the muscle, myo meaning muscle, and cardium, heart muscle. So here, this red area here is the heart muscle. And then over here, we can look at our different layers that we were just talking about. So closest to the heart muscle, the myocardium, we have the epicardium. And then this is the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. So here is our epicardium, which is closest to our muscle wall. Then right here, we have our pericardial cavity, so the space between these two tissues, and it has fluid in it, lubricating fluid, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And then we have our parietal layer of the serous pericardium, which is this one here, and remember that's fused to our outermost fibrous pericardium. So this is the really thick one. You can see kind of in the illustration here, they make it thick and fibrous. It's very thick and it's protecting the heart. Then we have our other layer here, this pink layer that's fused to it, which is the parietal pericardium. So the parietal pericardium here, which is a little bit softer. And then we have our epicardium, which is attached to our heart here. And then this area here is where we have our pericardial cavity that has the fluid, and that's going to allow the heart to pump and move without rubbing against the two tissues. So if we had lots of rubbing, if you can imagine if you hold your hands together like you were clapping and you kept rubbing and rubbing and rubbing them back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. If you did that every single day, all day long, all night long for your entire life, you would probably get some pretty painful blisters and cuts and things. And so we have this pericardial cavity with this fluid that prevents that from happening. So in most organs within the body, the visceral serous membranes, such as the epicardium, are microscopic. So generally when we're talking about visceral serous membranes, we're talking about something that we can hardly see, is microscopic. But in the case of our epicardium, it is not microscopic. We can actually see that on the heart as a nice thin layer that's protecting that muscle, protecting the heart. It also is protecting some of the veins and things, but we'll take a look at that, or some of the vessels, the capillaries on there. All right, so let me see where we're at here. Let's see, right here, but rather a macroscopic layer consists of simple squamous epithelium. If you remember from the tissues, our simple squamous epithelium is our single layer, simple, of squamous, which are the kind of flat scale-like shells. And this is, or scale-like cells, which are called the mesothelium. Okay, so we have our mesothelium there. which is reinforced with loose, irregular, or areolar connective tissue that attaches to the pericardium. Okay? So this mesothelium then is what is going to be secreting the lubricating serous fluid that fills the pericardial cavity. And this reduces friction as the heart contracts. So as I was mentioning, with the heart moving and heart contracting all the time, we don't want it to be rubbing against any other tissues. So we have this little area that is going to reduce that friction. It's going to have the fluid in there, and the fluid is made by the mesothelium. Okay, so the epicardium has the mesothelium, consists of the mesothelium, which then secretes this fluid that goes into the pericardial cavity and allows it to not become damaged over time because of all of the use that it gets. So inside the pericardium, we can talk about now the surface features of the heart. So the things that we can take a look at, which we've already talked about a little bit. So that includes the 4 chambers. So before I scroll down a little bit, first there's the superficial leaf-like extensions of the atria that are near the superior surface of the heart, one on each side, called the auricles. Okay, so let's take a look at that. So an auricle, which means ear-like, because it resembles the external ear of a human. I kind of always thought of it as resembling the external ear of like a floppy-eared dog or something, because they're kind of floppy and attached to the outside. So here we can see is the auricle, this kind of floppy, lumpy looking thing on the outside. So this is an auricle here. The reason that you can see this pointing and saying right atrium is because the right atrium is underneath that auricle. So our auricles are literally right on top of the atria. So you can see also here, this right here is the left auricle, and you can see it's labeled, the auricle of the left atrium. And so the atrium then is going to be underneath this auricle here. So our auricles are relatively thin-walled structures that can fill with blood, and they empty into the atria or the upper chambers of the heart. So the atria, remember, the upper chambers of the heart, and there are these flaps. They're kind of like little pockets, little kind of bubble fat-covered pockets that not only protect our atria, but also can fill with blood and then drain into the atria. You may have heard of them being referred to as atrial appendages. So also prominent on the surface of the heart are some fat-filled grooves, which are called sulci, plural. An individual one is called a sulcus. And they are along the superior surface of the heart. So along the outside of the heart, we have these grooves, kind of ditches along the heart that are sulcus, a sulcus or a sulci, or our sulci. And these sulci are actually, these indents are there because they have our coronary blood vessels. The major ones are located in these little dips. So in this illustration here, here's one here, and so there's actually a dip in the muscle here, and then within this dip we have our coronary blood vessels. In this case, our anterior interventricular sulcus is what this sulcus is called, and that has vessels. You can see the big vessels here. I kind of covered it up with my drawing, but it has these blood vessels in here, and you can see the red and you can see the blue, and that kind of dip down is just kind of like hugging those blood vessels in there. Those major blood vessels give them a little bit more space to exist and feed the blood to the muscles there, the actual heart muscle itself. They also have fat in those areas, so the fat is going to be protecting those major blood vessels that are on the heart, and then also protecting the heart as a whole. So located between the left and the right ventricles, so we have a sulcus around here, around here, here, and then on the underside here, the posterior side, we can see that there's one here as well. Okay, so you can even see the posterior interventricular artery is in our posterior interventricular sulcus, which is labeled here, posterior interventricular sulcus. So the sulcus is the dip or the indent, has our posterior interventricular artery because it holds the artery. Here we have our anterior interventricular sulcus, So here's our anterior interventricular sulcus, which then holds our anterior interventricular artery. Okay. The one I hadn't mentioned yet is our coronary sulcus, which is located between the atria and the ventricles, and that's this guy around here that wraps all the way around and comes back up on the other side here. That's our coronary sulcus. It's separating the atria from the ventricles. All right. So we can talk about the layers of the heart again. These, I want to mention, these are different arteries that you will need to know, arteries and veins, and we can talk about those in more detail. We've already talked a lot about the left pulmonary artery and veins. These are our major vessels up here that we've already talked about. Down here we have things like the great cardiac vein, which is going to be in that coronary sulcus going around. Our right coronary artery is there as well. And then we have, as we mentioned, our posterior interventricular artery, and then on the front, our anterior interventricular artery. It also includes our great cardiac vein. Okay, so we have our arteries and our veins. So those are in there. Here we have our posterior interventricular artery, and then here is the middle cardiac vein. Okay, same thing we have in our coronary sulcus. We have the great cardiac vein. And then what we have here are our circumflex branch of the left coronary artery. And then over here, oh, it actually is labeled here as our coronary sinus. I didn't notice that, but there's our label for our coronary sinus here. And then we have our small cardiac vein here as well in this coronary sinus, or sulcus, I'm sorry. That also includes the coronary sinus, which we'll talk about in a moment. All right, so the layers, the wall of the heart is composed of 3 layers of unequal thickness. So from superficial to deep, we have the epicardium. So on the outside, we already talked about the epicardium. We have the myocardium, which we briefly talked about also, myo meaning muscle, so the muscle of the heart. And then we also have the endocardium, which we haven't discussed yet. So the endocardium meaning on the inside. So the outermost layer of the wall of the heart is also the innermost layer of the pericardium, which is the epicardium. So that's why we already spoke about the epicardium, which is the visceral pericardium, or the epicardium is part of our pericardium, which are the layers on the outside that are protecting the heart, kind of the sac of the heart. That one is also part of the layers of the heart because it's attached to the heart. So that would be our most superficial layer of the heart itself. So when we talk about the 3 layers of the heart itself, the outermost one is the epicardium, which we already talked about. Then we have our middle and thickest layer, which is the myocardium, which is mostly made up of cardiac muscle cells. It is built upon a framework of collagenous fibers, plus it has the blood vessels that supply the myocardium and the nerve fibers that help regulate the heartbeat, or help regulate the heart. So the myocardium is the collagenous fibers plus the blood vessels, so some of those that we've already talked about, like the great vein and the interventricular or anterior interventricular artery, those types of things. And then the nerve fibers, which we haven't talked about and we'll talk about in the next section, that help regulate the heart. It is the contraction of the myocardium that pumps the blood through the heart and into those major arteries. And then the muscle pattern, they mention, is elegant and complex. So as the muscle cells swirl and spiral around the chambers of the heart, they form a figure 8 pattern. So they have a figure 8 pattern around the atria and around the bases of the great vessels. There are also deeper ventricular muscles that also form a figure 8 around the 2 ventricles and proceed toward the apex. And then we have more superficial layers of the ventricular muscle that wrap around both ventricles. So we have kind of this figure 8 pattern around the atria of muscle. We can look at that here. The atrial musculature, so we kind of have this figure 8 pattern around the atria that are going to pump the blood or squeeze or contract the blood going from the atria down into the ventricles. And then we have the deeper ventricular muscles that form the figure 8 around the 2 ventricles, and then we have more superficial layers of ventricular muscle that wrap around both ventricles. So we have the figure 8 here, like we just saw around the atria, and then we have the ventricular musculature, which you can kind of see is this figure 8 formation around the ventricles, and then we also have an outer layer that are around the ventricles. So although the ventricles on the right and the left sides pump the same amount of blood, remember we have that 70 milliliters that's moving from section to section, I'm not thinking of the right word, from the spaces, you know, from the atria to the ventricles, from the ventricles out, and then from the atria to the ventricles again. Since the left and the right sides pump the same amount of blood, the muscles, though, on the left ventricle is much thicker. So you can see in the picture here in a relaxed person or a relaxed heart or a contracted heart. This is our left side. This is our left ventricle here. You can see how thick the muscle is here versus the right side. You can see how thin, really, the muscle is here compared to the left side. The left side is thicker and more developed because it has to overcome the resistance required to pump blood into the long systemic circuit. So our right side of the heart, remember, goes to the pulmonary circuit, which is basically going to the lungs. So it doesn't have to pump it that hard, right? There's not much resistance. It's just kind of pumping it out so it goes here. Those aren't the spots where they go out, by the way. I just wanted to get that written there. So here and there, here and there, going right to the lungs. But if we look at the left side, which has a much, much further distance, we have to go all the way through the aorta, and then we're going to go up and to the limbs, upper limbs, then we're going to go down to the whole rest of the body. So it has much, much further to pump the blood than the pulmonary circuit versus the right side. So it has a lot less resistance. So it doesn't need as much thickness, it doesn't need to have as developed muscles as the left side does. The innermost layer of the heart wall, so now we've talked about the muscular layer, which is the myocardium. So we've already talked about the epicardium. Now we've talked about the myocardium. Those are 2 of the 3 layers. Then the innermost layer is the endocardium. The endocardium is joined to the myocardium with a thin layer of connective tissue. The endocardium lines the chambers, that was the word I was looking for, the chambers of the heart. The atrium is a chamber, the ventricle is a chamber. So the endocardium lines the chambers where the blood circulates and covers the heart valves. So we have this innermost layer that's going to help cover the heart valves, which we haven't talked about yet, but also lines those chambers, the atria and the ventricles. It is made of simple squamous epithelium, and it's called the endothelium. All right, so endo meaning within or inside. So endocardium, our layer of cells, our tissue, is within the heart. Within the heart is endocardium, and then the cells, endothelium, so within the cells that are within, which is continuous with the endothelial lining of the blood vessels. So we also have this lining on the inside of our blood vessels, which we'll look at in the next chapter, but we have a lining in the blood vessels, and that's a continuation of that lining that goes throughout the heart. So once regarded as a simple lining layer, recent evidence indicates that the endothelium of the endocardium and the coronary capillaries may play active roles in regulating the contraction of the muscle within the myocardium. So they're looking at this endocardium not just being as this thin layer that's kind of slippery and smooth to allow blood flow. They're looking at it as actually playing a part of a role in the contraction of the larger layer, the myocardium. The endothelium may also regulate the growth patterns of the cardiac muscle cells throughout life, so fixing muscle cells and growing those muscle cells. In the endothelins, it secretes create an environment in the surrounding tissue fluids that regulates ionic concentrations and states of contractility. So endothelins are potent vasoconstrictors. So if you remember when we talked about blood, we talked about endothelins. They're vasoconstrictors, so vascular and then constricting, so making the blood vessels smaller. And in a normal individual, establish a homeostatic balance with other vasoconstrictors and vasodilators. So part of allowing the muscle to be pulled in. So these endothelins are secreted, perhaps by this endothelium. So the endothelium secretes these endothelians, which makes the muscle cells contract. That's a vasoconstrictor, so it allows it to get smaller. All right, so our internal structures of the heart. So recall that the heart's contraction cycle follows a dual pattern of circulation. So we have the pulmonary and the systemic circuits. Because of the pairs of chambers that pump blood into the circulation, in order to develop more precise understanding, we're going to explore the internal parts of the heart here. So first let's take a look at the septa of the heart. So the word septum is derived from something that encloses. So a septum is like a wall or something that encloses something. So in this case, a septum, or if we're talking about multiples, we're talking about septa, refers to a wall or a partition that divides the heart into the chambers. So we have the different septa that are going to separate those chambers. The septa are physical extensions of the myocardium that are lined with the endocardium. So it's all part of the same stuff. We have the outside part of the heart, right? We have the three different layers, the epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. And then we just have a continuation, or kind of, you can imagine an infolding of that to make these walls or partitions, our septa. And they contain the same things. They contain a thick layer or thinnish layer, depending on the side, of myocardium, so of muscle cells, that are covered in that endocardium. So located between the two atria, so remember the atria are the two top chambers, is the interatrial septum. So separating the two top chambers, we have the interatrial septum or wall. Normally in an adult heart, the interatrial septum, there's an oval-shaped depression. So we have this kind of indent that's an oval shaped called the fossa ovalis, which is a remnant of an opening in the fetal heart known as the foramen ovale. The foramen ovale allowed the blood in the fetal heart to pass directly from the right atrium to the left atrium, allowing some blood to bypass the pulmonary circuit. So it kind of made it easier on the heart when the fetus is inside of the mother's womb. Within seconds after birth, a flap of tissue known as the septum primum that previously acted as a valve closes that foramen ovale and establishes the typical cardiac circulation pattern. So as a growing fetus in the womb, in the uterus, we have a foramen ovale, and then that's an opening. A foramen, if you remember from the skeletal system, is a hole. So we have this hole between the two atria, the top chambers. Then, within seconds after birth, we have the tissue flap known as the septum primum that's going to flap down and close that up. However, we still have this little depression or indent where it was. The flap isn't as thick as the rest of the septum, and that's called the fossa ovalis. It's an oval-shaped fossa, fossa meaning an indent. So then located between the two atria, we have the interatrial septum. So inter, between, atrial, the atria, and then septum, wall. So in between the atrium, wall. So then between our two ventricles is a second septum known as the interventricular septum. Same naming here, inter, between, and then ventricles and wall. So in the wall in between the two ventricles, interventricular septum. So unlike the interatrial septum, the interventricular septum is normally intact after its formation during fetal development. So we don't have any holes between the ventricles in development. It is substantially thicker than the interatrial septum since the ventricles generate far greater pressure when they contract. So our atria, when they contract, are just trying to push the blood down into the ventricles. The ventricles, however, are pushing blood either to the lungs or to the entire rest of the system. So the septum is much thicker than the interatrial septum. Then we have our septum between the atria and the ventricle, so between the top and the bottom chambers, and that's known as the atrioventricular septum. So atrium, ventricle, wall, so between the atrium and the ventricles, is marked by the presence of 4 openings that allow blood to move from the atria into the ventricles, and from the ventricles into the pulmonary trunk and the aorta. So those are our valves that we're going to talk about. Located in each of these openings between the atrium and ventricles is a valve, a specialized structure that ensures one-way flow of blood. So the valves between the atria and the ventricles, okay, so we're talking about the top chambers and the bottom chambers. The atria and the ventricles are known generically, so generally, as the atrioventricular valves. Again, between the atrium and the ventricle, valves. So atrioventricular valves. The valves at the openings that lead to the pulmonary trunk and the aorta are known generically as the semilunar valves. All right, so the valves that go between the top chambers and the bottom are atrioventricular valves. And then the valves that are going to open up to release the blood from the heart going to either our pulmonary trunk to go into the lungs or go into the aorta to go into the rest of the system are called semilunar valves. Semilunar comes from semi meaning partially, and lunar is lunar shape, a round shape valves. And you'll see when we look at the picture of them that they look like semicircle valves, kind of flaps. The interventricular septum is visible in this image. In the figure, the atrioventricular septum has been removed to better show the bicuspid and tricuspid valves. Those are atrioventricular valves. The interatrial septum is not visible since its location is covered by the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Since these openings and valves structurally weaken the atrioventricular septum, the remaining tissue is heavily reinforced with dense connective tissue called the cardiac skeleton, or skeleton of the heart. So cardiac skeleton. So the remaining tissue that is heavily reinforced, has dense connective tissue, is the cardiac skeleton. It includes 4 rings that surround the openings between the atria and the ventricles and the openings to the pulmonary trunk and aorta. So they serve as a point of attachment for the heart valve. So where we have those openings, we have a thickening of the wall. Basically, we have dense connective tissue. It's in reinforcement, and that's the part of the cardiac skeleton. The cardiac skeleton also provides an important boundary in the heart, electrical conduction system, and we'll talk about that in the next section. So I want to scroll down to the picture here so we can take a look at these different things. All right, so here is our picture of the heart. We can see here they mentioned that the septum, the atrial one, so the wall, right, between the different atria. Here's our right atrium here, right atrium, and then over here we have our left atrium. Those are the 2 chambers at the top of the heart. And then between them there is a wall, and that is where they were saying in the image you can't see that wall because the aorta here and the pulmonary trunk are in front of it, so it makes it difficult to see. Then we have our ventricles. So let's see, left ventricle label here. So our left ventricle here. And then over here we have our right ventricle. So this area here is our right ventricle. And remember, we have our separators, our walls between the 2 of those also. And then you can see actually one that is labeled is right here, our interventricular septum. So here's one septum that they can show because of this cut here. So interventricular septum right here. So a thickening here, you can see it's kind of like a wall that is separating our 2 ventricles. What they did show here for the septum between the atria, the interatrial septum, sorry, is the fossa ovalis. So you can kind of see they showed as this little kind of oval indent here that would be in the wall right here, or the septum between the 2 atria, the interatrial septum. All right, then if we move back up, we can see here, so we talked about the different septum here, the interatrial septum, which you can't really see in the image. We saw the fossa ovalis, which used to be a foramen ovale, and then was closed up by the septum primum after birth. Then we saw our interventricular septum, that really nice thick one between the 2 ventricles. Then we have our atrioventricular septum, which is separating our atria and our ventricles, which we can take a look at. And then we have our 4 different valves. Okay, so when we scroll down here, we have our different valves we're going to look at. So if we look at here, our tricuspid valve, this guy right here. So our tricuspid valve is one of our atrioventricular valves. So atrioventricular, between the atrium and the ventricle, valve. So the one on the right side of the heart, remember this is the right side of the heart, is called the tricuspid valve. And that's because there are 3 cusps. Tri meaning 3, and cusps are like flaps of tissue. So our tricuspid valve is this valve right here. And remember, there's actually a thickening here, which is part of the cardiac skeleton. This is an opening, and then blood is going to flow from this atrium through this tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. On this side, we have our atrioventricular valve as well, between our atrium and our ventricle, which is the mitral valve or the bicuspid. I like bicuspid because it tells me what it is. Bi meaning 2, and cuspid, 2 cusps. So if I'm looking at an image, I can see that there are 2 flaps here of tissue. And actually you can kind of see, we'll talk about the muscles here that attach them, but here's 1 cusp, and then here's the other cusp. Versus here, there's 1, 2, 3 flaps, 3 cusps. So on the right side, we have our tricuspid valve. On the left side, we have our bicuspid valve, which is between the atria and the ventricle, atrioventricular. Again, we have our cardiac skeleton in here. Then we have our valves that are going to open up from the ventricles to either the pulmonary trunk, if we're talking about the right ventricle going to the pulmonary trunk, and then our left ventricle going to our aorta. So if we're talking about the right side, we have our right ventricle, and then moving up, we're going to force the blood up through the pulmonary trunk to then go to the lungs. This right here is one of our semilunar valves. Okay, so this is our pulmonary semilunar valve. Pulmonary because again it's going to the lungs. So it's labeled here as the pulmonary valve or pulmonary semilunar valve, and this is the lunar shape right here. And then kind of hiding back here, you can see, is our aortic valve, our aortic semilunar valve. And you can kind of see these flap things again here. It's going from our left ventricle to our left aorta, or not left aorta, to the aorta. Left ventricle to the aorta. It's going to be forcing the blood up this way, then going to the system. All right, so those are our septa. Again, we looked at our different chambers, and we looked at our valves. So we have our atrioventricular valves, we have our semilunar valves, and then specifically they're called tricuspid valve on the right side, bicuspid valve on the left side. We have our pulmonary semilunar valve going from the right ventricle to the lungs, or to the pulmonary trunk, then the lungs. Then we have our left side, the left ventricle going to the aorta, has our aortic valve. All right, so we're going to skip through that, and we're going to take a closer look at our atria. So first we're going to take a look at our right atrium. So the right atrium serves as the receiving chamber for blood returning to the heart from the systemic circulation. We've kind of talked about that already quite a bit. The 2 major systemic veins, the superior and inferior vena cava, and the large coronary vein called the coronary sinus that drains the heart myocardium empty into the right atrium. So the superior and inferior vena cava are coming from the system. So superior, again, meaning like up above or to the top part of our body. So the superior vena cava is draining blood from the top part of our body, above the heart. Our inferior vena cava is draining blood, pulling blood from the bottom part of our body, so below our heart. Then we have our large coronary vein, called the coronary sinus, that drains the heart muscle then, the vessels that are all along the heart itself. And that's going to empty into our right atrium. And that's talking about that here, I guess. The superior vena cava is going to drain blood from the head, neck, upper limbs, and the thoracic region, so the heart and up, and it empties into the superior and posterior portions of the right atrium. The inferior vena cava is going to drain blood from things that are below the diaphragm, so lower limbs, abdominal, pelvic region of the body. It also drains into the atria, but inferior to the opening of the superior vena cava, so just a little bit lower. There are two openings there. Immediately superior and slightly medial to the opening of the inferior vena cava, on the posterior surface of the atrium, the backside of the atrium, is the opening of the coronary sinus. So this thin-walled vessel drains most of the coronary veins. So we're talking about the veins that are on the heart itself. Coronary meaning the heart. So coronary veins that return systemic blood from the heart. Okay, so we have things that are draining the top part of the body, superior vena cava, draining the bottom part of the body, inferior vena cava, and then we have to have things that are draining the actual heart itself, which is draining from the coronary sinus. While the bulk of the internal surface of the right atrium is smooth, the depression for the fossa ovalis is medial toward the middle, and the anterior surface toward the front demonstrates prominent ridges of muscle called pectinate muscles. So the right auricle also has pectinate muscles. The left atrium does not have pectinate muscles except in the auricle. So when we're talking about the atria, we're talking about our right atria, and we're talking, or atrium, sorry, we're talking about our right atrium and our right auricle. Remember the ear-like flap that covers the atrium, and that has pectinate muscles in it. Our left atrium does not have pectinate muscles, except in that left auricle. So the atria receive venous blood on a nearly continuous basis. So it's just, the blood is just kind of pouring into and being flowing into our atria, preventing venous flow from stopping while the ventricles are contracting. So we don't want our blood to be pooling up in our limbs, for example. So we constantly have blood pouring into our atria coming from our body. While most ventricular filling occurs while the atria are relaxed, they do demonstrate a contractile phase and actively pump blood into the ventricles just prior to ventricular contraction. The opening between the atrium and ventricle is guarded by the tricuspid valve, which we just mentioned. So our muscles, our heart, right, when it is relaxed, we're pulling blood in from our body, right? The upper part of the body through the superior vena cava, draining into our right atrium. The lower part of our body, our inferior vena cava, just draining into that right atrium. And the atrium, for the most part, is sitting there relaxed. When it is relaxed, you can see that it drains into our relaxed right ventricle. So we're just draining the blood through. Then we do see, just before our right ventricle is going to contract, or the ventricles are going to contract, we do have a contraction of our atria. So our first contraction of the atria kind of closes up, forces some of the blood that's in the atria to get into the ventricles. Then we'll have our contraction of the ventricles that will then force the blood out into the two directions. So let's take a closer look at our right ventricle now. So the right ventricle receives blood from the right atrium through the tricuspid valve. Each flap of the valve is attached to strong strands of connective tissue called the chordae tendineae. So the chordae tendineae are the strings that are attaching the flap of the valve to a muscle. So literally the tendinous cords, sometimes called the heartstrings. There are several chordae tendineae associated with each of the flaps. So it's not just one string. There are several strings going to each flap of, for this example, the tricuspid valve. So there are 3 cusps. Each of those flaps, those cusps, have these strings attached to them, the chordae tendineae. And those chordae tendineae then are attached to, each of the flaps are attached to our papillary muscles. So they are 80% collagenous fibers and then elastic fibers and endothelium. So we have these kind of strong but stretchy fibers that go from our cuspids, our cusps, and then attached to these papillary muscles. And these flaps attached to these papillary muscles, and they extend from the inferior ventricular surface. Okay, so inferior, the bottom part of the ventricle. There are 3 papillary muscles on the right ventricle called the anterior, posterior, and septal muscles that correspond to those 3 sections of the valves. So when the myocardium of the ventricle contracts, so when our ventricle is contracting, pressure within the ventricle chamber rises, right? So if we're squeezing something, the pressure of the fluid inside of the chamber that we're squeezing is going to increase. There will be more pressure. So blood, like any fluid, flows from higher pressure to lower pressure areas. So it gets really high pressure in that ventricle when we're squeezing it, and it's going to push that out toward the lower pressure areas. So in this case, toward the pulmonary trunk and the atrium. So to prevent any backflow into the atrium, the papillary muscles also contract. So those muscles are going to contract. They're going to generate tension on the chordae tendineae, so they're going to contract by pulling those cords, and that's going to prevent the flaps of the valves from being forced into the atria and regurgitating the blood back into the atria during ventricular contraction. Okay, so if we take a look at a picture of that, then maybe that'll make a little bit more sense. I guess we can go back up to this picture here. All right, so we have our contractions occurring. So we have our blood passively flowing up into our right atrium, passively flowing into the right atrium, flowing down into our right ventricle. When that's happening, again, remember, it's just passively flowing when it is relaxed. And then we have our atrium up here that is going to slightly contract and force blood down into the ventricle. Then our ventricle is going to contract to then force the blood up through the pulmonary trunk. So when that happens, these muscles that I outlined down here are going to also pull, and they're going to pull on the chordae tendineae to make sure that these flaps here stay closed, so that the pressure doesn't go back up into our right atrium, and instead will go into our pulmonary trunk. And we'll see the same thing on the left side. So we'll have the blood that's flowing into the left side here, and then it's going to passively flow into the left ventricle. And then when the left ventricle is going to contract to go out through the aorta, we are going to see our bicuspid valve here with its 2 papillary muscles that are labeled here, pulling on these cusps, on these tissue flaps, to make sure the blood doesn't go back into our atrium and instead goes out through the aorta. So we will scroll down to those sections. All right, we're going to finish up talking about some of the other muscles here, though. So we're going to talk about our trabeculae carneae. So the walls of our ventricle are lined with our trabeculae carneae, which are ridges of cardiac muscle covered by endocardium. So we have lots of muscle ridges in there, and that's our trabeculae carneae. So that's different from our myocardium, which is the big, thick layer of muscles. In addition to these muscular ridges, and a band of cardiac muscle, also covered by endocardium, is known as the moderator band. Okay, these reinforce the thin walls of the right ventricle. Okay, so remember, the right ventricle has a thinner layer of myocardium, and so we have reinforcements with this moderator band, and also we have our trabeculae carneae, which plays a crucial role in cardiac conduction, and we're going to talk about that in the next section. So it arises from the inferior portion of the interventricular septum and crosses the interior space of the right ventricle to connect with the inferior papillary muscle. Okay, so our inferior bottom portion of our interventricular septum, the one that separates our ventricles, and then crosses the interior space of the right ventricle, so crosses through the right ventricle space to connect with our inferior, the lower papillary muscle. When the right ventricle contracts, it ejects blood into the pulmonary trunk, which then branches into our left and right pulmonary arteries that carry it to each lung. The superior surface of the right ventricle begins to taper as it approaches the pulmonary trunk. So then at the base of the pulmonary trunk is the pulmonary semilunar valve, which we already took a look at, that prevents backflow from the pulmonary trunk. So once we have forced the blood out of our right ventricle, pushed it out through into the pulmonary trunk, then when there is a relaxing of the heart muscle, we don't want it to flow back down the pulmonary trunk into the ventricle. So we have this semilunar valve that is going to allow the blood to pool up in it, preventing it from going back into the heart. And then when we have the next contraction, it's just going to push it through the pulmonary trunk again. Now we can take a look at our left atrium and our left ventricle. So after exchange of gases in the pulmonary capillaries, right, so we are gaining our oxygen in the blood and then releasing the carbon dioxide, blood returns to the left atrium, high in oxygen, via one of the 4 pulmonary veins. So coming from the lungs, we have the pulmonary veins going into our left atrium. While the left atrium does not contain pectinate muscles like the right atrium does, it does have an auricle that includes these pectinate ridges. So again, in our left auricle, that flap above the atrium, we have our pectinate ridges or pectinate muscles. Blood flows nearly continuously from the pulmonary veins back into the atrium, just like we saw on the right side, which it going continuously from the body, which acts as the receiving chamber. Again, our atria are the receiving chambers. From here through an opening into the left ventricle. So most blood goes passively into the heart while both the atria and ventricles are relaxed, just like we saw on the right side. But toward the end of the ventricular relaxation period, our left atrium will contract, pumping blood into the ventricle, just like we said on the right side. This atrial contraction accounts for about 20% of the ventricular filling. So these contractions of the atria are going to add about 20% blood volume to the ventricles. The opening between the left atrium and left ventricle is guarded by the mitral valve, which again I like to call the bicuspid valve, because then I can just easily remember the bicuspid is on the left side, has 2 flaps, on the right side, tricuspid, 3 flaps. Then we have our left ventricle. So recall that although both sides of the heart will pump the same amount of blood, the muscular layer is much thicker in the left ventricle compared to the right, again because it has to go to the whole system. So like the right ventricle, the left also has the trabeculae carneae, so those ridges of muscles in the inside there, the cardiac muscle, but there is no moderator band, so no band that's going to help just make sure that that right side gets the pressure that it needs while not being too muscular, because it doesn't need as much pressure. The mitral valve is connected to the papillary muscles via the chordae tendineae, just like the right side. There are 2 papillary muscles on the left side, however, so the anterior and posterior papillary muscles, as opposed to the 3 on the right, again reminding us of the bicuspid valve. All right, so now we're going to take a closer look at the valves, talking about these cusps and such. So a transverse section through the heart, slightly above the level of the atrioventricular septum, atrium, ventricle, septum, the separation between the atrium and the ventricles, reveals all 4 of the heart valves along the same plane. Okay, so we're going to take a cross section that's basically like cutting the top half of a person from the bottom half of the person, right, along the atrioventricular septum. So between the right atrium, I'm going to scroll down so we can take a look at the picture here. So between the right atrium and the right ventricle, right, so draining between the right side, right atrium, right ventricle, is the right atrioventricular valve, or what we also call the tricuspid valve. Okay, so this is the right side here. So up here would be our atrium. Down here is our ventricle. So here we have our tricuspid valve, and you can now very clearly see the 1, 2, 3 cusps, tricusps. The 3 pieces or flaps of tissue. So it consists of 3 flaps or leaflets made of endocardium reinforced with additional connective tissue. So it's a nice thick flap of tissue. The flaps are connected by chordae tendineae to the papillary muscles, which control the opening and the closing of the valve. So that's inside here of the ventricles. Then we'll be talking about the left side. So this is the left side. So up here, which is cut off, would be like the left atrium. And then we have our bicuspid or mitral valve. So bi meaning two. So there are two flaps there. Again, they're attached by the chordae tendineae on the left ventricle or inside the left ventricle, which control the opening and closing with those papillary muscles. But in this case, we have the two papillary muscles versus the three because it's a bicuspid valve. There are two flaps of tissue. So here, then, emerging from the right ventricle at the base of the pulmonary trunk is the pulmonary semilunar valve, or the pulmonary valve, also known as the pulmonic valve or the right semilunar valve. So lots of different names. This one is talking about the general term, so it's the right side, right, and then semilunar is the general term for both of these valves. So semilunar valve. More specifically, the pulmonary semilunar valve, or pulmonary valve. Comprised of three small flaps of endothelium, reinforced with connective tissue, make sure they're strong, and then when the ventricle relaxes, the pressure differential causes the blood to flow back into the ventricle from the pulmonary trunk. So this flow of blood fills these pocket-like flaps of the pulmonary valve, causing the valve to close and producing an audible sound. And we'll talk about that lub-dub. So unlike the atrioventricular valves, there are no papillary muscles or chordae tendineae associated with the pulmonary valve. So there aren't any cords or any muscles that are pulling this closed. The only thing that pull these two valves, the pulmonary valve and the aortic valve, which we'll talk about in a moment, closed, is simply the pressure differences in the flow of blood. So if you look at this one, since we were talking about that one first, the pulmonary valve or pulmonary semilunar valve, down here, right, is where we would have our ventricle. So down here is the ventricle on the right side. And then up here, which is cut off, would be our pulmonary trunk. So when the blood is flowing out from the ventricle, it's going to go up through that pulmonary trunk. When then the ventricle relaxes, we're going to have blood dribble down, if it doesn't get all the way out and into the lungs, dribble down, and it'll fill up these little cusps. So these are flaps that'll drizzle down, it'll fill it up. And then that's what closes them, because we'll have dribbling down and filling up of each of these flaps, and then it ends up closing them so the blood does not go back in. And we see the same thing in our aortic semilunar valve. So coming from our left side of our heart pumping out, going into the aorta, if we have anything that doesn't make it all the way through the aorta, getting to the rest of the body, it's going to dribble down the vessel and it's going to pool up in these flaps here. Pool up here and pool up in here, and then it ends up closing those flaps, making it so there isn't any backflow into the ventricles. So then we have that in the words here. So we have our mitral valve or our bicuspid valve between our atrium and our ventricle on the left side. Two cusps, I'm not going to go through all this again, and then we have our aortic valve or aortic semilunar valve, which prevents the backflow from the aorta into our left ventricle. So composed of three flaps, just like our pulmonary semilunar valve is. And then this also produces a sound when it closes. So the two atrioventricular valves are open and the two semilunar valves are closed in that picture, in the illustration in the 19.13a. So this occurs when both the atria and the ventricles are relaxed and when the atria contract to pump blood into the ventricles. But then 1913 shows a frontal view where only the left side of the heart is illustrated, and the process is virtually identical on the right. So here we are. So they're showing, or they were saying in words there, the tricuspid valve is now open, and you can see that blood can easily flow through that tricuspid valve that's on the right side. And then again here, the bicuspid valve is open, and so blood is flowing from the atrium, or atria, because we're talking about both here in this case, I suppose, going down into the ventricles, which are actually down here in the drawing. And then you can see this is the side view that they were talking about. So the mitral valve, or the bicuspid, is open, so the blood's coming in from the lungs here and dribbling down through and filling up this ventricle. And it's going to fill and fill and fill and fill and fill. And then when we have contraction, this is going to close this valve here, and it's going to be forced out of the aortic valve, which you can see here is closed. And I think this is a good way to see here how if we had blood that's being forced out this way and then it doesn't get up and all the way out through the aorta, it can drizzle back down and it'll start to pool up. Drizzle back down and pool up in these valves, and then that closes them to where nothing can get back down into the ventricle. And then here is the illustration they were mentioning where we have now our pulmonary valve, pulmonary semilunar valve, and aortic semilunar valve are open. So we have blood flowing out, kind of up through. If you can see, down here would be the ventricle, down here would be the ventricle coming up through the aorta. And now these are closed. This is what they look like when they're closed, so that when it's contracting, blood isn't coming up from the ventricle and getting up here into the atria on both sides. And then here you can now see down at the bottom, the bicuspid valve is closed, so the blood is not flowing into the ventricle at this time. It's closed because contraction is happening here, which is forcing this to be closed. Specifically due to the pressure also, because if blood is trying to be forced, right, we've got a high amount of contraction happening here, a high blood pressure, it's going to be pushing up against these flaps, actually forcing them closed, whereas it's pushing against these flaps, forcing them open. All right, so that is kind of exactly what I was describing here. So when the ventricles begin to contract, the pressure within the ventricles rises and blood flows toward the area of lowest pressure, which is initially in the atria, and then this backflow causes the cusps of the tricuspid and the bicuspid valves to close. So as that's being pushed up, it closes those valves. They're tied down to the papillary muscles by the chordae tendineae. During the relaxation phase, then, the papillary muscles are also relaxed and the tension on the chordae tendineae is slight. However, as the myocardium in the ventricle contracts, so do the papillary muscles, creating tension on the chordae tendineae, holding those in place, preventing them from being blown back into the atria. So the aortic and pulmonary semilunar valves then don't have the chordae tendineae or the papillary muscles. Instead, they have those pocket-like folds that as the blood kind of flows back, so when the ventricles relax, the change in pressure forces the blood to go toward the ventricles, but then they pool up with blood, and then that actually closes those valves. All right, so I think that we'll stop this recording here, and then we'll finish up the coronary circulation on the next one, because we've got a couple more. All right, let's go ahead and actually continue here with the coronary circulation. So we're going to talk about the blood flow now to the heart itself. So when we're talking about coronary, we're talking about the actual heart as a whole feeding the myocardium. Okay, so now we're not talking about the great veins going to systemic circulation and pulmonary circulation. We're talking about the circulation that feeds the muscles of the heart itself. So you will recall that it's a remarkable pump with cardiac muscle cells. They're incredibly active. So like all other cells, a cardiomyocyte, so that's a heart muscle cell, cardiomyocyte, requires a reliable supply of oxygen and nutrients and a way to remove wastes. Just like all the other cells, it needs to be able to do that. So it needs a dedicated, complex, and extensive coronary circulation. Because of the critical and nearly ceaseless activity of the heart throughout life, the need for a blood supply is even greater than for a typical cell. So we have lots of little tiny vessels on the heart just to feed those heart muscle cells. However, coronary circulation is not continuous. It goes through cycles, so it reaches a peak when the heart muscle is relaxed and nearly ceasing while it's contracting. So basically, it kind of goes through this pumping motion itself in a way where the blood is going to flow through and by all of these muscle cells as the muscle is in its relaxed state, so it can get that happening so that as the cells are relaxing, they're not actually functionally doing contraction at that moment. They can then exchange waste and oxygen and nutrients, and then as it's contracting, we don't see that blood flow to the actual cells themselves. So let's first take a look at our coronary arteries. Okay, So our coronary arteries supply blood to the myocardium and other components of the heart. So again, we're talking about supplying the blood to the heart itself. The first portion, and we're going to go through the words here and then we'll take a look at the illustration. So the first portion of the aorta, after it arises from the left ventricle, gives rise to the coronary arteries. So remember, on the left side, we're talking about oxygenated blood. So we're talking about arteries. Arteries carry blood away from this is hard to say, with the heart. It carries it to the tissues that need oxygen. Let's put it that way. So arteries are carrying blood to the tissues that need oxygen. So in this case, the tissue that needs oxygen are the blood cells, and it's carrying oxygenated blood. So coronary arteries are going to supply the blood to the myocardium, so it's going to come from the left side because the left side of the heart has oxygenated blood. So right after our left ventricle, right, going into the aorta, we have the rise of, or the beginning of, our coronary arteries. So there are 3 dilations in the wall of the aorta, just superior to the aortic semilunar valve. So remember, superior meaning up above. So just up above that valve, we have these little openings. So 2 of these, the left posterior aortic sinus and the anterior aortic sinus, give rise to our left and right coronary arteries. So left side posterior, kind of behind the aortic sinus. So that aortic sinus gives rise to our left coronary artery. Anterior, meaning forward or front, aortic sinus gives rise to our right coronary arteries. Then the third sinus, the right posterior aortic sinus, typically doesn't give rise to a vessel. So our coronary vessel branches that remain on the surface of the artery and follow the sulci are called epicardial coronary arteries. So the coronary vessel branches, so we're just talking about our coronary arteries, so our left and our right coronary arteries, branches from those coronary arteries that stay on the surface, that remain on the surface of the artery, and follow the sulci, that indentation, are called the epicardial coronary arteries. Okay, so we can scroll down to our image just to get those first branches. Take a look at those first branches. So we're going to look here. This is our anterior view, so the front side. We're talking about, so here's our left ventricle coming up here and putting blood up through our aorta. So our aortic semilunar valve is going to be in here. And then we have our left coronary artery, so feeding the left side. So this is the left side, this is our right side of the heart. Our left coronary artery going toward the left side, and then here is our right coronary artery going to the right side of the heart. Okay, and then we're going to talk in more detail about the branches from that. So we've got the base there. So the left coronary artery distributes blood to the left side of the heart, so the left atrium and ventricle, and that interventricular septum. So the septum, the wall that separates the ventricles, the big thick one. The circumflex artery arises from the left coronary artery and follows the coronary sulcus to the left. Okay, so the coronary sulcus, remember, is right under those auricles. Circumflex, I remember that because it's around. So circumflex artery goes around. So it starts from the left coronary artery and then it's going to follow that coronary sulcus around the heart to the left. Eventually, it will fuse with the small branches of the right coronary artery. So it goes around the heart and then is going to meet up with the right side, all the way on the underneath side, posterior. The larger anterior interventricular artery, anterior front, between the ventricles artery, also known as this, I don't care that you know that, so I'm not going to say it, is the second major branch arising from the left coronary artery. So we have our left coronary artery that we saw coming from the aorta, then it's going to branch. It's going to branch into our circumflex artery and our anterior interventricular artery. Okay? It follows the anterior interventricular sulcus, that dip in the middle in between the ventricles, and around the pulmonary trunk. It kind of goes around the pulmonary trunk and continues through that sulcus. Along the way, it gives rise to numerous smaller branches that interconnect with the branches of the posterior interventricular artery. So the underside, the posterior side, interventricular between the arteries, or between the ventricles, artery, forming anastomosis. So an anastomosis is an area where vessels unite to form interconnections that normally allow blood to circulate to a region even if there is partial blockage in another branch. So an anastomosis is like a webbing of blood vessels that are all going to help feed an area, so that if one of these little tiny capillary-like vessels gets blocked, that it still has blood feeding to that region. So the anastomosis and the heart are very small. Therefore, this ability is somewhat restricted in the heart, so coronary blockage, coronary artery blockage often results in death of the cells. Myocardial infarction, an MI, or a heart attack, supplied by the particular vessel. So let's take a look at that again. So we're going to look at the branches of our left coronary artery. So again here, our aortic valve, aortic semilunar valve, we've got the left side, which is our left coronary artery. And then as we follow it, it's going to branch off here. So you see this branches here and then goes there. This one is going to go around, remember, circumflex artery. It's going to go around. And then down this way, this branch is our anterior interventricular artery. So it's going to go through that interventricular sulcus down that way. So anterior on the front part of the heart, interventricular, here's our right ventricle, left ventricle, between those two, artery. Okay? Here we go. So then the right coronary artery, we're going to look at that now. That's this one down here, going to the right side. Remember, this is our right of that heart. Proceed along the coronary sulcus, remember this indent underneath the auricle here, and distributes blood to the right atrium, portions of both ventricles, and the heart conduction system. So normally one or more marginal arteries arise from this right coronary artery inferior to the right atrium. A marginal artery, then, is one that supplies blood to the superficial portions of the right ventricle. And you can see that. Let's look at the illustration. So again, we have our right coronary artery here going along the sulcus. And then you can see coming off of here, feeding our right atrium, or our right ventricle rather, is our marginal arteries. So these branches are going to be marginal arteries that are feeding that right ventricle. On the posterior surface of the heart, so the back side of the heart, the right coronary artery gives rise to the posterior interventricular artery, okay? Also known as the posterior descending artery. It runs along the posterior portion of the interventricular sulcus toward the apex of the heart, giving rise to branches that supply the interventricular septum and portions of both ventricles. So we can scroll down slightly and we can see the posterior part of the heart, or posterior illustration here. So if we look, see up, let's see, so we'll label it here. This is our right side here and our left side here. So you can see the right coronary artery coming along here. Let me scroll up just a little bit here. And then you can see our marginal artery, so posterior view, this is our right side, our right coronary artery coming up. Another one that branches off of the right coronary artery is our marginal artery. But then it continues to go along, and then it goes down our posterior interventricular sulcus, so it's our posterior interventricular artery. Okay, and then you can even see, we talked about our circumflex artery. Remember, our circumflex artery goes around the heart to the back side, the posterior side, and then you can see here, and then we even have a marginal artery coming off of the circumflex artery. That came from the left side. Okay. All right, so we finished up that chunk. If we go down here, it's a little ways, but then we're going to talk about the veins. So let's talk about the coronary veins. Again, those are the veins that are going to feed the actual heart muscle itself, the myocardium. So our coronary veins are going to drain the heart, right, the actual heart muscle cells, the myocardium, and generally are parallel to the large surface arteries. So they run along with the arteries. The great cardiac vein can be seen initially on the surface of the heart following the interventricular sulcus, but eventually flows along the coronary sulcus into the coronary sinus on the posterior surface. Okay, so we're going to see that great cardiac vein. So now we're talking about things that take away the blood from the tissues. So draining the blood, bringing the carbon dioxide rich blood, deoxygenated blood away from the surface cells of the heart, away from the heart. So we see that great cardiac vein. It's going to wrap around. Actually, let's just take a look at that great cardiac vein really quick, and then we'll take a look at the other ones. So here we can see, as soon as it gets in focus here, our great cardiac vein is right here on the anterior surface, our anterior view. You can see in our interventricular sulcus here, our great cardiac vein is going to go along here, and then it's going to go to the posterior side. So if we look down here, here's our great cardiac vein on the posterior side. It's wrapping around, and it's going to come all the way down to here and end up at our coronary sinus. Okay, and then the next section that we'll be talking about, the next paragraph, is going to talk about our middle cardiac vein, which is here in our posterior interventricular sulcus, and it's going to also drain to our coronary sinus. And then we are going to have our small cardiac vein, which you can see labeled here, our small cardiac vein, which is going to come along from this side, the right side, and drain to our coronary sinus. And then we have our middle one, and then we have our posterior cardiac vein as well, which is right here, draining into our coronary sinus. So we can look at the words for that here as we scroll past this big box section here. All right, so once it gets focused here, we have the posterior cardiac vein. So we talked about that, posterior cardiac vein, so that parallels and drains the area supplied by the marginal artery branch of the circumflex artery. Okay, so we have the circumflex artery that came around, and remember, branches off that circumflex artery are called marginal arteries. So our posterior cardiac vein is going to drain those areas. Then our middle cardiac vein parallels and drains the areas supplied by the posterior interventricular artery. Right, so we saw that in the posterior interventricular sulcus. Then our small cardiac vein parallels the right coronary artery, the one that kind of dipped around in the coronary sulcus, and drains the blood from the posterior surfaces of the right atrium and the right ventricle, because that's on the right side, our small cardiac vein. So then the coronary sinus is a large, thin-walled vein on the posterior surface of the heart, lying within the atrioventricular sulcus. Remember, that's right under the auricles separating the atrium and the ventricles, and emptying directly into the right atrium. Okay, so that's going to go right into the right atrium. So when we're draining all these things, it goes into this sulcus, or the sinus rather, the coronary sinus, and then it's going to drain into our right atrium. So the anterior cardiac veins that parallel the small cardiac arteries drain the anterior surface of the right ventricle. Okay, so anterior cardiac veins parallel those small cardiac arteries on the front side, anterior to the front, and then drain the anterior surface of the right ventricle. So unlike these other cardiac veins, it bypasses the coronary sinus and drains directly into the right atrium. So again, we have our great cardiac vein that will eventually drain into the coronary sinus. We have our posterior cardiac vein, which is going to drain the area supplied by the marginal artery. And then that's going to go into our coronary sinus. Then we have our middle cardiac vein, which is in our posterior interventricular septum, sulcus, along with our posterior interventricular artery that then goes into our coronary sinus. And then we have our small cardiac vein, which is paralleling the right coronary artery that also goes into the coronary sinus. All of those are going to drain into the coronary sinus. The coronary sinus then is going to drain directly into our right atrium. The only veins that do not, right, are those that are part of the anterior cardiac veins. Okay, so those are the ones that are draining the anterior surface of the right ventricle, and then they are going to drain directly into the right atrium. Okay, so we can take a look at our anterior cardiac veins here in the anterior view of the heart. All right, so here we can see here are our anterior cardiac veins. Again, remember this is where we have our right coronary artery draining, or flowing along here, and then we have our marginal arteries, and these are all in our right ventricle, feeding our right ventricle muscles. Then we have our anterior cardiac veins that are going to drain our right ventricle muscles, and then these anterior cardiac veins are going to go right here directly into our right atrium. Okay. Then down here we already looked at our great cardiac vein right here. And we looked at these different ones also. Our posterior cardiac vein along here, and then our middle cardiac, and then our small cardiac vein here. They're all going into this area to drain into the coronary sinus that then is going to go into our right atrium. All right. Oh, okay, so I think we got through that section there. So bypasses the coronary sinus, goes directly into the right atrium. Great. So then the next section, we are going to be looking at the cardiac muscle and how it has its electrical activity, how it actually undergoes the process of contraction. So this first section, the 19.1, you need to be very familiar with all of that anatomy, where these things flow, where they branch, how they work, the different chambers, the different parts of the chamber. So all of the things that we talked about, you should be able to label all of those things and understand all of those things. So that is important for moving on to the next section, so that you understand what exactly is happening in the heart when we talk about the conduction system.